Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we are going to hear about the book, The Stronger Women Get, the More Men Love Football. It was it was written 1994, published in Britain 1996, but 1994, let's say. It's by Mariah Burton Nelson, and we're going to be discussing it. That's me, Jo Brew, and Dorothea Annison. So, at the beginning of the book, the chapters we have are: we don't like football, do we? Feminism and football now and then, stronger women, boys will be boys, girls will not. Scoring, what's sex got to do with it? And you can read the other ones. Mariah Burton Nelson is a former professional basketball player, author of the only national women's sports column. This was in the book, so this is what it said then in 1994. She's also written for Washington Post, the New York Times, Ms magazine, and Cosmopolitan, amongst many more. So she's, at the time of writing, very, very sort of distinguished sportswoman and also journalist, writer. Her first book, Are We Winning Yet? How Women Are Changing Sports and Sports Are Changing Women, received the Amateur Athletic Foundation's Book Award. And she's currently working on the third book, I guess, which we would be able to get, The Courage to Compete, Winning, Losing and Intimacy in Women's Lives. And I just added to the screen this bit, withdrawn. So you can see that in the, that was stamped in the beginning of the book. And just for info, you can get copies of this book and many, many, many more on archive.org. You have to sign up, and then you can borrow the book for free for 14 days. And so that's the way I read it. And that's a really good thing. And I think this is an ex-library book, because it's sort of ironic, isn't it, that so many of our radfem books or feminist books are withdrawn. Okay, so something from the first chapter that I thought was interesting is saying, if you grew up female in America, you heard this: sports are unfeminine. And this: girls who play sports are tomboys or lesbians. You got this message: real women don't spend their free time sliding feet first into home plate or smacking their fists into soft leather gloves. So you didn't play, or you did play, but either way, you didn't quite fit. You didn't fit in your body. You didn't learn to live there, breathe there, feel dynamic and capable. Or maybe you fell madly, passionately in love with sports, but didn't quite fit in society. You never saw yourself, basketball player, cyclist, golfer, reflected in movies, billboards, and magazines. So that's part of the beginning. You can see from this, it's just incredibly well. It's brilliantly written. And I mean, on every page there was a quote that I thought we need to share this. And by it is absolutely highly recommended for everybody to read it. And also, by the way, you can buy it, so you could buy it on Amazon or something, or in other places. Okay, so we're going to now go on to Dorothea. Over to you, Dorothea, for the next slide.
Hi. I must admit, when Joe asked me to do this webinar, but I don't know anything about sport because I was one of the girls that got turned off sport at school, particularly, yeah, partly by bullying by other girls, because I think team sports can be a way of, sort of status hierarchies and that sort of thing. And I was the one that was at the bottom of that one. And so I've not really taken much interest in sport or thought about it much. I can see it's sort of linked to, masculinity and that. But this book really opened my eyes about what a radical feminist analysis brings to it and why it is a feminist issue. She shows how sports are at the heart of teaching men domination and violence, and that's a feature, not a bug of the system. And yeah, I thought it was really interesting. And the book is particularly focused on the US, so I may misunderstand some of it because I know less about American football than I do about our football, soccer, and baseball and basketball. I know nothing about, but yeah, it's really good. It's really, yeah, and it's actually quite witty in places as well. I do like her way of phrasing things. So this is why I think this was important. It's the last bastion of male domination when, even though women are making, advances in other areas. And it's a particular form of masculinity, toughness, aggression, denial of emotion, and a particular denigration of all that's considered female. And I think that's something that comes out at different parts in the book that men in sports are actively hostile to women and want women to fit a certain model, which is basically about service and sexualization. Um, and so that, it creates masculinity with violence, male bonding based on the illusion of male supremacy. And so manly sports set the stage for violence against women. Um, so it's kind of part of the justification of male violence. Kind of the next slide, Joe. This again is from the first chapter where she's setting out the key issues. On the playing fields, male athletes learn to talk and think about women and women's bodies with contempt. It's a women's issue because male athletes have disproportionately high rates of sexual assaults on women. It's a women's issue because female sport participation empowers women, thereby inexorably changing everything. So one of the things she's really stressing is that sport can be positive for women. It could, it's about body positivity and confidence and feeling strong. And I understand that, but I've got a slight skepticism about it because women getting in, she said if women get involved in sport, it'll help to change things. Well, women get involved in politics doesn't change things that much. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but we've got a long battle to climb. But I mean, anything that helps women stop hating their bodies and trying to copy unrealistic celebrity looks will be good. But I always remember that sports origins are, if you go back to the Olympic Games in Greece, it was about preparing men for war. And the things they used, like the javelin, the discus, were actually weapons. It was weapons practice. And I think it teaches men and women in team sports to value competition, hierarchy, and a winner-take-all mindset. Which I think isn't particularly good for anybody, but certainly not for women. Maria does say later, she says that sport doesn't teach men to be good human beings, that we do need a different model. So yeah, I think I'm still remaining a bit of a sports skeptic. And then I think the next slide is me as well. That's sort of just how they've worked out. So um, do we have that? Yeah. So this is the chapter that's very much looking at the history of women in sport, and Joe's going to talk a bit more about that. But I think this quote, it again, it's very much key to the whole account of how sport constructs women. Media often interpret female athletes not as powerful or strong, but as charming and seductive and vulnerably sexy. Nearly naked women pose passively smiling, exuding neither strength nor exhilaration. So the positive effects that sport can have for women are not always made obvious to women. Women in sport still have to fit the stereotype. We were talking before about Wimbledon and how the women playing at Wimbledon, although they can wear shorts, are still very much often wearing, very short skirts so that they still are conforming to femininity. And that is the whole, it's the whole thing. It's the contrast between femininity and strength. They just don't go together, which is what I'm going to go on to later. And the acceptable sort of physical activity for women has always been things like dancing or aerobics, but that's stressing thinness a lot of the time. It doesn't, I mean, dance in particular does need a lot of strength and stamina, but that's de-emphasized. There is a fear of women becoming stronger and more confident via exercise. A little thing that she put in that I never knew before is actually the development of male bodybuilding happened in the late 19th century as a part of the backlash against the first wave of feminism. That was the idea, the idea of the ideal male physique was very sort of bulky, muscled, was developed as a backlash against feminism. I thought that was interesting. So, Joe, do you want to move on to yours?
Yeah, so I liked this quote where she says, women and fair-minded men need to pay attention. We live in a country in which the manly sports culture is so pervasive that we may fail to recognize the symbolic messages we all receive about men, women, love, sex, and power. We need to take sports seriously, not the scores or the statistics, but the process, not the focus on who wins, but on who's losing. Who loses when a community spends millions of dollars in tax revenue to construct a new stadium and only men get to play in it and only men get to work there? I mean, again, you can see how brilliant the writing is and also how thought-provoking she is, where she's saying this constructs our society, that we need to not just go along with it, not just say, oh, we want more women's sports on television, or we want to be able to play in those stadiums. We need to say, well, no, who's losing in terms of access to resources, but also who's losing culturally. And I suppose in here she's saying this new stadium is constructed and only men get to play in it. That's with 1994, she's saying it. And we have been given a lot more access as women to sport and to stadiums and to even being on television. So you often see in Britain now women's football, and I think that's part of this move towards a form of equality where they will put women's football, like soccer, on the television quite often, really quite often. But it seems to me it's not because, well, it's partly it doesn't matter anyway, because the whole of sport is the glorification of masculinity. And so if women are doing it, to some extent, they're just showing that we're weaker and we're just showing that. But glorifying sport glorifies masculinity. So women doing it also glorifies masculinity. And it's also very, very cheap. And it's like reality TV. You get all these people to go on and cook a souffle or something for for free, and they're pleased to be on it, and they work on reality TV for free. Women are essentially filling up the airwaves is very, very cheap content. That's my thing. So I think she's talking at a time when women were still being very much denied access to sport, and she was asking for more space for us. And I think it's probably just pre-Title IX, but maybe an American will be able to tell us. If it was written in 1994, that Title IX, as far as I remember, came a bit later than it. So women got sort of structural access a bit later on. Right, okay. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and
Yeah.
hand back to you,
Yeah.
Dorothea.
I mean, I think it's not surprising that the women's sport now that does get television coverage is football because it's a male sport, so men will watch it. A lot of women at school in Britain, I mean, I think they do possibly play football now than more than when I was at school, but we played netball and hockey. Now, netball and hockey don't get on the television. Gymnastics only gets on the television during the Olympics, and it's only when the so is it the thing that's like it's not because they're not showing it for women because women might enjoy women's football. They're showing it for men because men might enjoy watching, women in shorts run around and it's still not really I don't feel it's really centering women, and those footballers often still, especially when they're off screen, seem to conform to the femininity, the long hair, the long nails, the high heels, that sort of thing. Actually, somebody said to me in a conversation recently is that they'd been watching the women's Euros and they thought it looked as they were concerned that it looked as though some of the women had had mastectomies, and that didn't
Wow.
fit in with the idea of body positivity. So, so on one hand, it might create body positivity, but on the other hand, is it part of the, delusion some women are having that they can escape femininity by becoming men? I just think I mean, the more I actually start thinking about sport, the more interesting it is than I thought it was. So, um,
Yeah, and I'm just going to say about the mastectomies that there's
mm,
also, if you watch football, I used to watch football in, let's say, the early 90s, women's
mm,
football, and there'd be short hair, quite butch looking or sort
mm,
of not
mm,
performing femininity. They'd be
mm,
strong and muscly like women are not meant to be. And
mm,
now all the footballers have blonde. They dye their hair blonde and they have a
mm,
ponytail.
mm,
It's like, it's almost like it's necessary if you're going to
mm.
be in a national football team to perform femininity. And
Yeah.
certainly they do when they come off the pitch, they quickly put their high heels on.
Mm, yeah. Anyway, we'll move on. So this slide is related to chapter 3, which is called Stronger Women. And I like the first quote. It's very much, you might think, well, it's fairly basic feminism, and it probably was in 1994, but I think in 2025, when women are being told to disconnect from their body, that we're being told that bodies aren't to do with the oppression of women. I think it's really good to sort of restate this and remind ourselves what's at stake. Feminism is about bodies, birth control, sexual harassment, child sexual abuse, pornography, date rape, battering, breast cancer, breast enlargement, dieting, liposuction, abortion, anorexia, bulimia, sexuality, sports. So it fits sport within that, feminist focus on women's bodies and what happens to our bodies. And I think at a time when certainly reproductive rights are under attack around the world, it becomes more important. And it's one of these things, again, where you see something from 30 years ago and think how little progress we've actually made on any of these issues. In some cases, as I say, retreat. And of course, we've got the added new one now of the so-called gender dysphoria and women sort of hating their bodies for that reason. So I just think that is, I wanted to include that just to remind us what's at stake here. And the simple act of women taking control of their own bodies, including their health, their pleasure, and their power, is radical. And yeah, I really like that because it just it shows what's at stake, and why there's so much backlash against women wanting to take control of our bodies, and the sort of pushing us into keeping a certain look. And so in some ways it's got worse. You've got all this like Instagram face and things like that, and women having much more normalization of things like Botox and fillers, even for very young women. So the other thing she then moves on to in that chapter is talking about how women are not taught to be strong and defend ourselves. That women are actively kept weak by the culture. I remember, I'm old enough, I'm sure many of us are, remember when there used to be women's self-defense classes, and there was a recognition that women could and should learn techniques to try and deflect male violence, that we weren't totally powerless, that there were still things that we could do. Meanwhile, boys and men are positively encouraged to fight. And I think that, she was mentioning some things about, I think it was ice hockey, where the fighting is part of the game. There is an expectation, and even certain players whose job is to fight. Um, so they're just learning from the sport and the fighting in the sport how to dominate women, which is, yeah, not good. Um, so yeah, anyway, I'll stop it there.
Yeah, so I'm just going to read a couple of bits from the
Mm,
chat. So there's from Sheila Jeffries in the chat. It says, a good example of the
mm,
humiliation of sportswomen was the wearing of a near naked dress by the England goalkeeper Mary Earps to receive the Sportswoman of the Year in 2023.
mm,
Um, which I think there is a lot of gatekeeping around
mm,
who gets to be in the teams or who wins
mm,
the and then who role models what it is to be a successful sports
mm,
person, or in this case
mm,
woman. And then there's another point I wanted to read out.
mm,
um this is from Jane H, who says sports becomes a form of manspreading in public space. I think of
mm,
those golf
mm,
courses. There are 6 council ones in her city. almost male-only space, dominating the physical space of publicly owned land. Compare the size of women's spaces. Even in sports, women's ones take up less space and tend to be indoors, e.g. badminton, ice skating, and netball. And I think that's a really good point, sort of linked to that. It's the construction of, oh, well, it's a man spreading in public space. Makes lots of sense.
Mm.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is also in the same chapter we were in. So this is a quote. So she writes, laughing, Patrick Thevenard would scoop his wife, Gail Savage, off the floor and carry her around the house like a squirming child. This was early in their marriage, and Patrick, an ecologist from Hyattsville, Maryland, thought it was funny, a joke. Gail, a history professor, didn't like it. Feeling helpless and angry, she would ask to be put down. He would refuse. Later, Gail became a dedicated runner. Patrick argued that she was running too much, or in the wrong way, or at the wrong times. They would quarrel, and he would yell. Patrick didn't literally lift her off the ground then, but to Gail, the sensation was similar. Patrick's criticisms felt like physical restraints, as if he were trying to prevent her from going where she wanted to go. Patrick says Gail used running as a weapon against him, a way to escape out of our relationship, to literally put physical distance between us. Gail says running became the focus of a power struggle over who would control me. And
Mm.
just say there's so many bits of writing in this book like this. It's an incredible pleasure to read it. Because so many of us have had these experiences where there are battles over what's supposedly meant to be a sort of apolitical thing, which is sport, or, we think it's completely fine to go running, but males in our lives, if there are any, um, will on a micro scale try to use to prevent female empowerment or females doing what they want to, and see it as sort of quite a threat to their masculinity if females run. So yeah, let's see if there's
Yeah.
another thing. And then there's another quote, this again from Sheila, says, yes, men take over the parks. Often girls sit in the sidelines and chat as the men perform. The thing that makes me completely livid about this sport thing is my local park. If I go there on a Saturday or Sunday morning, there's loads and loads of little boys being taught football, soccer, by probably voluntary men. And then there's the mums and dads, but actually quite a few dads, but there are loads of mums. And then there's lots of girls sort of standing on the sideline watching. And every now and then you get one girl looking like she'd like to do soccer. But you can sort of see that's just not going to go well. The boys are going to turn on her, the coaches are going to turn on her, because they're constructing masculinity. They're constructing what they're going to be or what it is to be a man. They're not just running around playing soccer. And I suppose I'd go back to the title that the more power women get, the more men love football. And I think, which is a fantastic title. I haven't quoted it completely, but it is a way that they are uh, fighting back, and they're loving it and spending more time in it. I suppose it's porn as well, but we're talking about sport here.
Mm.
Okay, going to hand back to you.
Yeah, I think the running thing is interesting because I think one of the reasons that women are attracted to running as a physical activity, and that running is the only sport I've ever really done consistently. Sadly, I have had injuries and I've had to stop it now. And I think it's because it's a different type of competition. It's you against the clock. And you can, so your progress is largely within your control. You do the training, and you can improve your time. Um, and so I think it's that thing about how I think what women may want to get out of sports and physical activity may be different from what men want to get out of it. And I read a thing recently in the media about an increase in men spitting at women runners, which is just
Mm,
so disgusting. And so how dare you be out here taking up space in public? Um, I mean, I never had anything like that happen to me, but it is this thing that women feel they're not actually safe in the outdoors. That you have to stay, stick to brightly lit streets, and it does, that it does increase your confidence. Because you get used to going out and, just ignoring everybody else and, doing what you want to do. Yeah, actually, I'm reminded one of the very first activism that I did as a girl at school. I was like 10 or 11, and I asked if there could be a girls' soccer session because I really hated netball and hockey. I hated them so much. And I did manage to persuade one of the teachers to do a soccer session. It was only a one-off there, but that felt less, I don't know, for some reason it felt less hostile to me. But so yeah, where are we? Right, yeah, sorry, I've got so again, I love the chapter titles. Boys will be boys and girls will not. Yeah, and it just set up this thing about how sport is, it's part of the gendering. It's part of, you go that way and you go that way, and never the twain shall meet. But the whole chapter is really, really interesting, and I think one of the ones that she may now, sort of reconsider, because it's very much looking at whether or not women are the weaker sex, and therefore, how should sports be organized? Is there a place for mixed sex sport? And how do you determine who should be in a women's team? And I think events have overtaken us on that one. But I think it is the case that women are told we're the weaker sex, but weaker in which way? There are different types of strength. So men do have greater upper body strength. That's a fact. But women have good lower body strength. Women have the strength to give birth to babies. Women are better at flexibility and endurance. So at sort of ultra marathon running, like when they do 24 hours or run up the Pennine Way and that sort of thing, it is, women are better than men. We are better at endurance. I know not everybody would want to do that, but that isn't as recognized as as the glory of sporting achievement in the same way that, being a football player is, or running the 100 meters is more important than running the ultra marathon. I mean, whether that's just because it's easier to televise, but it's, women's the attributes of strength and physical ability that women have are, one, not valued, and two, we are not often encouraged to develop them. So girls are not taught to develop our bodies as men are. So we don't know, often what sort of untapped potential we have. And one of the things I think holds women back as well in sport is the fear of being unfeminine, of being self-conscious, at taking unfeminine postures or sweating or things like that. And I think that's one of the reasons that female-only sport is important at all levels. That sometimes that there's been, oh well, we'll keep the elite sport female, but grassroots doesn't matter, does it? But it does, because that's where the vast majority of women are going to be. And I didn't put this on a slide. I'm just going to read it out because this is a bit of debunking of male physical superiority. Those who claim male superiority are not remembering jock straps. Because men's genitals dangle precariously outside the pelvis, they are vulnerable to speeding baseballs and angry fists or feet. In addition, bikes with dropped handlebars bring the rider's legs close to the stomach, and the testicles can get squashed or twisted against the saddle. This can lead to gangrene and amputation. So a bit of debunking of the strength. But I think I pulled this quote out because I think it very much gets to the crux of the matter. And she says, my dictionary defines Amazon as a tall, strong, masculine woman. We don't have a word or even a concept for a tall, strong, feminine woman. What would she look like? Act like? We have instead the word Amazon, a term equated with female power and in the same breath with masculinity, and therefore deviance or aberrance. Why are Amazons so threatening? Why, when women refuse to act ladylike, do men react with fear? Why does female strength somehow diminish male strength? And my response to that would be the reason we haven't got a concept for tall, strong, feminine woman is that is a contradiction in terms. Femininity is defined as weak. Femininity is defined in a way that doesn't allow strength. You have to be weak, subservient, passive, all those negative things. So the conflict between men and women in patriarchy, is exemplified in sport. Men tell women that we are weak so that they can appear strong. And athletes challenge this idea, and therefore they have to be put back in their place and denigrated. So slurs are used against successful athletes. Amazon is used as a slur. Lesbian is used as a slur. And it's part of the policing of women in sport. Don't be too sporty, or you might be thought to be a lesbian as though that was a terrible thing. And I think that might be one of the reasons that in the men in sports debate, some women are so keen to deny that women face a disadvantage against men if they take part in female sport. They fear that by conceding some physical difference, it's admitting that women are weak and powerless in all areas of life. Whereas a radical feminist can be realistic about the biology of sex differences and male advantages in particular sports, but we can still know that women are strong and brave because we have to be to survive. So I just think we need to have better, more positive images of unfeminine women. It needs to not be seen as a negative thing, moving away from femininity. But we've got a long way to go, because what we have instead is women that want to move away from femininity, feeling that the only option is to think that they can become a male rather than being non-conforming, rather than being a lesbian, whatever is right for them. So yeah, that's I don't know what's next. I need a bit of a
Right, so I've got various things to just mention before I go on to read this quote. So one thing is that Mariah Burton Nelson, who wrote this book, emailed Dorothea a little while ago, and possibly emailed me, but I didn't read it. And it's really fantastic. She says that she's very active. She's in the fight to defend women's sports, and she was planning to come today, but I've been looking in the participants, the people here. I can't see her name. So, but if you are here, Maria, and want to join in and come on as a panelist, put your hand up. There's a little button you can do, a little yellow button where you put your hands up. Then we'll bring you on as a panelist. But if you don't, if you're not here, then so be it. Obviously, you can't come on. Anyway, it's fantastic. And apparently she works with our Cara, with Cara Dansky, on various issues. So she's very much sort of active right now. And we'll try to get her to come onto Feminist Question Time or one of these to maybe talk about some of her other books. It's very exciting for us. Secondly, when Dorothea, you were talking about the sort of the difference in women's power that comes up a lot in this book. It makes me remember the great book by Gerd Brandenburg, The Men's Daughters of Regalia, where the public space, it celebrates female abilities, and the big party, the big celebration of the whole year is the menstruation games, and it's a role reversal. It's just so it's just totally celebrating female bodies. And she tells the story of that in Daughters of Regalia, of this boy who feels an outsider and a failure because he can't menstruate. And it's just a brilliant book. But I think often when we're reading these books, they spark other thoughts and the links and the insights that are coming from other women's books. And and together they build up this understanding of what's going on. Then another one that I've just been thinking about is this book by Mariah Burton Nelson refers to and tells lots of stories of women participating in sport and being denied participation and what their ideas were, including sort of first wave feminists. And she mentions Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who did loads of sport and really, like, she writes in her writing, so I ran 1 mile a day. Charlotte Perkins Gilman did, and she did press ups, and she really enjoyed having a strong physical body. And in her book, Herland, there's a very interesting thought. A thought I thought is that when there's this one-on-one male against a female situation where the male who visits this woman's land, which is only women's land, tries to rape his girlfriend or starting to be girlfriend, immediately there are loads of other women around who stop him and overpower him. And I think that's a very interesting. I think Charlotte Perkins Gilman thought quite a lot about the difference between men and women and how we can create a society where we do have different bodies, but that men don't take advantage of that by creating one-on-one situations where it's okay to be violent. And I think that's making me think about that in this sport. Just so I don't forget it. I'm going to put in the chat, I wrote an essay, which I will put in the chat, which goes a bit further than this book. And it says that soccer is a celebration of rape. Is just basically celebrating rape. And I make the argument in there. I've put it in the chat on Substack. Oh, and someone's saying that Mariah Burton Nelson is on Substack as well, which is great. So we'll definitely try and keep up with her. So, but if you want an even tougher, more extreme argument, have a look at my Substack thing that I did. Okay, right. So now I'll go back to this quote, which is from the book. So, where a wife and a husband, or a female and male pair of friends, are likely to find themselves evenly matched. So this is in things like bowling or skiing. In sports, as in the rest of life, women do compete with men on a daily basis and often win. So it intrigues me that in response to my discussion of women's athletic excellence, men change the subject of football. It's very interesting, isn't it? They try to assert football as the sine qua non, the if not nothing, of athleticism, because women could never play football, they imply. Men are physically, naturally, biologically superior. So most men can't play pro football themselves. They're talking about that American football, or she is. But they can take vicarious comfort in the display of male physical competence and aggression. They take comfort in professional baseball. Women could never play pro baseball. And in professional basketball, women could never play pro basketball. And boxing, women could never box. And in foot races, women could never win the marathon. And I think that's very interesting, where this idea of men taking vicarious pleasure in being a man. This is masculinity. This is the stuff this is proof that men, that they're part of that group, are better than women. And also the discussion that they're changing the subject to football. I sort of notice quite often men will talk about football and I try and stop them and change the subject away from it. But loads of women do it as well. They just go along with that. I think it's like a form of femininity in a way. It's talking about football is performance of their subservience, in my mind. Great. Okay, so let's go back to Dorothea. Okay, over to you again.
So this chapter, scoring what sex got to do with it, looks at the way that sex and sport are intertwined in all sorts of ways. She's not talking here about the sexual assaults, that's in subsequent chapters, but this is just about the routine sexualization of women as part of sports, as eye candy basically, for the men. So sport and sex go together. The message sent in football stadiums, sports magazines, in sports bars and in communities where boys are athletes and girls are cheerleaders is not just about exaggerated gender roles. It's about domination, sex as conquest. In order for men to remain dominant, to remain victorious, Women must be in a subservient position, or they can be trophies, rewards to success in the intra-male hierarchy. In this system, women are never teammates, never idols. So the roles for women within sports are things like, cheerleaders, where it's young, scantily clad women cheering on the men. And I think that, then as it's implied that they are trophies afterwards, that the players, expect to get to have sex with the cheerleaders, but also subservient in more everyday ways. So, a man may be watching football, with or without his friends, and he expects his wife, his woman, to bring beer and sandwiches or whatever, to keep women subservient. Why is there such a link between big sporting competitions and domestic violence, which shows up in the statistics? Whether England win or lose, apparently there is still an increase in male violence after an England match. So it's something about men releasing that tension. They think they're entitled to release it, that tension onto bodies of women by beating women. And I think it's this thing as well. As you think about the language, beating, you beat your opponent, you beat your wife. You score a goal, you score if you manage to have sex with a woman. And there's probably other ones as well. So she gives examples of this, like cheerleaders and dancers at matches. She talks about a sort of particular team in their stadium, where the men had the blow up sex dolls and were sort of waving them around or fondling them or whatever, and eventually that did get stopped because the women objected. um but sexual harassment is rife against other athletes, against women journalists. I mean, we remember the recent, well, it's not so recent now, it's a few years ago, but the Spanish woman footballer that was assaulted by a male official who was supposedly, he's just kissing her because they're all so happy because they'd won. And luckily he did get found guilty of that assault, but I'm sure many other men obviously get away with it. And she talks about the sports bars. And these sports bars are supposedly about watching the big game on a big screen, but they've also got strippers and lap dancers there. So it's just part of the sex industry and part of this link of subservient men, subservient women, oh, if only, subservient women making men feel better, and that they want to have women that are powerless, that they can dominate. Um, yeah, and the other thing she wrote, which I didn't know, she said the dictionary definition of sport includes sexual play, which is another one of those word links, and I didn't know that one. And but for men, sexy women are powerless women. So the women athletes must still be sexy as men define this, so vulnerable and not threatening. So in, hyper feminized clothes, skimpy clothes, volleyball players who wear bikinis, runners that are wearing incredibly short shorts, um, and not sort of emphasize the strength. I'll come on to some more of that, the sort of feminization later, but that's the end of my bit on this one. So, Joe.
um, this follows on. It's from the same chapter. So
Mm,
this is talking about sex and violence in related to sport. So it
mm,
says for at least 15 minutes in 1993, everyone knew about the Spur Posse. They were the Lakewood, California teenage boys, mostly football players, who turned sex into a sporting contest, tallying points scored for each instance of sexual intercourse. At last count, Billy Shahan, 19, was winning with 66 points. Tabulations were compared to their sports heroes' uniform numbers, as in, I'm 44 now, Reggie Jackson, or I'm 50 now, David Robinson. They named themselves after their favorite basketball team, the San Antonio Spurs. Several girls said the boys forced them to have sex. The girls' parents and lawyers asked that charges be brought on 10 counts of rape by intimidation, 4 counts of unlawful sexual intercourse, 1 count of forcible rape, 1 count of oral copulation, and 1 count of lewd conduct with a minor under 14. 9 boys were arrested. The boys maintained that the sex had been consensual, like, for example, a young girl. And then it's absolutely disgusting what the boys said in court. So I just didn't read it, put it in there because it's so upsetting. But you can, well, read it when you read the book. It's just so horrible that they thought this was a fun game. And then a bit later on, a couple of paragraphs later, it says the young boys bragged about their exploits on everything from Nightline to Dateline to Donahue and the Home Show. I don't consider myself a normal person, one said. I think I'm a step above everyone else. And not only is this revealing about what sort of groups of boys and males egging each other on gets where they get to, but also that they got to go on these TV shows. And it's sort of, I mean, it's good that it sounds as if in America, I guess some people might remember that coming out. It sounds as if probably people were negative about it, but it happened, and we know it's still happening in many situations. I mean, pretty much every year or more than that, there are situations where groups of males attack women or make it into a sport that they will get these sexual contests. They're going to win. They're going to score against women. Yeah. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and hand back to you, Dorothea.
So, and again, another wonderful chapter title, Men in Tight Pants Embracing, which is football, American football, I think. And so the chapter is really about the hidden homoeroticism in male sports. Because for male supremacy to succeed, to continue, men need to bond with each other to establish those sort of, bonds of trust and loyalty and fraternity. And sport's a key way of doing that for men. It's possibly maybe one of the more important ones. So while sport offers man a place to worship traditional manhood, paradoxically, it also offers a man a place to loosen the rigid masculine role without losing status. In sports, men can exhibit emotions for other men. They can embrace, hugging, touching, and kissing without threat of ridicule and suspicion. Much of sport, I think, is an elaborate stage set to enable men to feel. I mean, I wonder what they are feeling. It's certainly not feeling anything positive about women. But later on in the chapter, she says sports culture teaches all men to love men and hate women, which is actually really scary. That's not a good thing at all, obviously. But it's because it's a mock battle. Sport is a mock battle, and it's a way of channeling male aggression up to a point, because obviously then it still does sort of spill out into actual real violence against women. But it's also a way of establishing hierarchy. And I think that kind of male supremacy, they want to get a hierarchy of men, who's the alpha male. And a lot of it's about that, and then which men are sort of cast out at the bottom as nerdy geeks. So the violence, and including sexual violence, becomes part of a man proving his manhood if he's aspiring to be one of these alpha males. It's also about celebrating and even worshipping hypermasculine bodies, because she's very much talking about how American football is, I think it's seen as the pinnacle of sport in America. Obviously, I'm coming at it as a uninterested Brit, so I may be getting some of this wrong. But the male footballers, they have those very powerful shoulders, and then the padding makes them look even bigger and stronger. So they have that kind of Incredible Hulk look, and that's what's seen as the apex of masculinity. But even outside of that, talk about sport is a basic male conversation topic. So it's the thing that you talk about with the guys at work. or guys down the pub or whatever. Every man's supposed to have his team and talk about how his team's doing, and it's a connection. And I know from actually asking a man uninterested in sport that it is a barrier. It does mean that you're really not, a bit on the outside and excluded if you don't want to take part in that kind of sports banter. Um, so yeah, it's really there. And that's why I think that this is what has kind of opened my eyes a bit from sport to something like it's boring, it's over there, it's men's stuff, but I don't need to, I really need to care about it. That actually it's more fundamental than I realized in actually helping men to enforce male supremacy and patriarchy, which is scary. So anyway, I shall hand over.
Yeah. So there's another good thing in the chat from Jane H. It says there seems to be a strong correlation, and I'm sure there'll be research somewhere, that men in sport are
Mm.
more violent, and certainly successful ones escape justice for violence against women, e.g. Stan Collymore, Ched Evans, David Goodwillie, etc. Also, the culture of paying for sex, e.g. Wayne Rooney, I guess, the UK football
Mm.
player, and then a lot use surrogates, e.g. Tim Daly and Ronaldo. And then, brilliantly, she writes, I'm going to have to go up again, all the
Mm.
axes of patriarchy combined. So, and then, yeah, so that's very good. So, and then Sheila says, yes, Jane, as you say, men's sport forms a foundation for male domination in the construction of masculinity and violence and lowering the status of women. This webinar shows how it all comes together in sport, which is right. Okay, so here's another quote. If a pro football game that lasts 3.5 hours, only about 16 minutes are actually playing, according to an evaluation. The rest is taken up with players huddling, picking themselves up off piles of men, running into the line of scrimmage, rehuddling, 1 hour 53 minutes, commercials, 26 minutes, halftime 16 minutes, penalties 10 minutes, injury delays, and other delays including timeouts, official measurements, and fights. Clearly, men who love football are not wading through 3.5 hours of television to see a few spectacular touchdown pauses. There must be more to it. In the past, sports had a spiritual and sexual significance. Folk football or mob football, the modern game's ancestor, was played during medieval times as part of religious springtime celebrations of renewal and fertility. So that's very interesting. There's so much in here. It's so well researched and lots of interesting, thought-provoking ideas. Now I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is, I thought it was me. So here, just as ballet, opera, and pairs skating offer ritualized celebrations of heterosexual love, manly sports offer ritualized celebrations of homosexual love. But because homosexuality is forbidden, well, it was a different time, 94 to now, and it's interesting how sports has changed. So we might, Maria hasn't put her hands up, so I think she's not here, but let's try and get her on to say what her thoughts are now, because this is a long time later. So manly sport, it's forbidden. Great pains are taken to disguise the men-worshipping men nature of the event. Sexism, homophobia, and violence do the trick. The dancing girls validate spectators' heterosexual credentials. Frequent fag jokes, clear indications that homosexuality is on men's minds, re-establish the supposed heterosexual status of the speaker. And the blood and brutality, as Michael Messner has noted, draw attention away from the display of affection between men. Yet violence and sex are integrally connected to the vast 7 billion pornographic culture and much of popular culture. It produces the products of both cultures are consumed and produced primarily by men. It is men who, after victorious military battles, rape. It is men who, in the army, sing a song in which they refer to their penises as guns. This is my weapon, this is my gun. One is for killing, the other for fun. The violent element of sports, such as football and boxing, while disguising a homoerotic subject, may also intensify men's erotic pleasure in watching these events. Bloodlust. So, very interesting. And again, I sort of urge everybody to read it. It's just brilliant writing. Okay, back to you, Dorothea.
Right. So I've actually the next two chapters are really important, but really hard to sort of summarize because they're the ones the sexual chapter sexual assault of spectator sport is about the gang rapes and how men are more likely to rape and more likely to we know yeah, men are more likely to gang rape. I said that right. I'm getting this, but sportsmen are more likely to gang rape. Um, but it's just sort of a lot of it is kind of stuff we know already, especially about the chapter on the abuse of by coaches of young women. It's the same failures that have been found in all sorts of organizations where people turn away. They don't want to see the sexual abuse that's going on. If the sexual abuse is found out, it's dismissed. It's nothing happens, not and I think this possibly is something that over the last 30 years has improved, that at least there is more awareness of this and possibly more policies and laws. But of course, we know that policies and laws don't actually stop rape. But I thought the best part of the two chapters was where Maria herself was abused as a teenager and by her coach, and she contacts him um, to sort of talk to him about it and see how he responds. And it's appalling because he tries to deny responsibility and it's full of self-pity. So I'll sort of a couple of quotes here. He says, "Okay, so we made a mistake. You made a mistake," I corrected him. "Okay, I accept that I made a mistake. I was older." But then he said, "Don't you think you had any responsibility?" He asked plaintively. "No, I was a child," I said. "Okay, you're right." Then later, "It wasn't forced. It wasn't drug induced. It wasn't sexual harassment. It was sexual abuse," I said. "Statutory rape." More silence. Then, "You don't know how badly, if I hurt you, that I want you not just to accept an apology from me, but to forgive me." And I think that thing, "if I hurt you." So he's not accepting or realizing the impact of his actions as an adult man on a teenage girl, even 20 years later. And she finishes by saying that he was still working in high school sports, and he may well still be doing it because he obviously doesn't realize that what he did was wrong. um yeah, I've got nothing more to say on that. That says it all.
Okay, so next one. This is about uh well, I'll just read it because it's interesting. During 2 long days at the rape trial of 3 college basketball players, the courtroom was packed with people leaning forward, straining to hear the graphic testimony. Sitting up front near the judge and jury were the women who said it was rape and the 3 men who said it was sex. This is how gang rape trials usually proceed. One woman says she was raped, and several men say no, she chose to have sex with us. When male athletes are involved, it becomes an issue not only of a woman's word against the men's, but of athletic privilege. When female athletes are involved, the women in this case also played basketball. It becomes too a question of teamwork. How could these men rape their sister basketball player? Why would they? By the end of the trial, second day, the spectators had segregated themselves the way fans do at a basketball game. The women's supporters on one side, the men's on the other. Sort of showing how much like a sporting act it is. I'm just going to look at the next slide. Okay, I think that let's do this as the last one. So,
Mm.
Dorothea, you do this,
Yeah.
and then we'll wind up.
Yeah. So this is about how women athletes are denigrated and dismissed by male commentators and journalists in sport. So these are real phrases that she's extracted from it. So they're frail, they collapse, they're kittens, they're girls, they're women, children, they're small, they're young, even when they're not. And the implication is that only big people, men, should be athletic. female champions are not super women, but little girls. And they also were doing things like stressing, oh, she's a wife and she cooks and cleans. That she is still being the subservient woman. And photographs in magazines. She says there's a thing of tennis player Steffi Graf photographed in a swimsuit. Why? It's just, and just one quick thing regarding the court case that you started talking about. The thing I pulled from that is that they were very much enacting a porn scenario on the body of that poor young woman. The way it's described and the way it, and that's why they couldn't see anything wrong with it, because they couldn't admit that they'd done anything wrong. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, look, we're 11:01, so we've gone over time. Very bad of us.
Mm, mm,
Um, I think we could probably go on for another 4 hours. I'd just like to read the book to everybody because it's so fantastic. But everybody, this is one of the best books, I think. Um, and we'll definitely try and get the author Mariah Burton Nelson onto in some way if we possibly can, because it'd be lovely to hear what
mm,
she's thinking now.
mm,
Um, so it's been a great pleasure reading this. And
mhm,
we were just saying beforehand, in the chat room while we were getting ready for the webinar, with Marion Rotiliano and Sheila Jeffries, we were saying none of us had ever heard about this book. We've been doing this series of Radfem
mm,
perspectives for 4 years or something, and particularly Sheila's been an academic working in this field forever, for decades and decades and decades.
mm,
And so Marion was, but
mm,
it's just unbelievable how we didn't, these things have passed under the radar. So it's thank you everybody for being here and for meaning that we make sure we come and that we're all doing this together.
mm,
So as always, thanks a lot. There are
mm.
breakout rooms. We've
Yeah,
put them in the Q&A.
yeah. I'll see you there in a
Yes, Dorothea brilliantly is going to do the breakout rooms. So see you next week or in
Yeah,
the breakout rooms.
yeah.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thanks very much,
Bye.
Dorothea. It's brilliant.